Imagine standing in the heart of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, not as a tourist, but as a resident fighting for space in a world without a single modern comfort. The air is not fresh, but thick with the heavy scent of unwashed wool roasting grain and the sharp tang of wood smoke drifting from thousands of tiny clay ovens. Below your sandals, the limestone paving stones are polished smooth by millions of footsteps. Yet the narrow alleys are slick with the runoff of a city that never stops moving. We often envision the biblical world as a series of serene, sun-drenched landscapes. But the reality for those who lived it was far more visceral and demanding. In the cities of Jesus' time, survival was a loud, crowded, and sensory-heavy ordeal where the heat of the midday sun could turn a stone house into an oven. To walk these streets was to navigate a complex web of Roman steel religious law and the constant pressing hum of a population living on the razor's edge of subsistence. From the grand shimmering gold of the temple heights to the dim dung-scented shadows of the lower city slums, these urban centers were masterpieces of engineering and monuments to inequality. Here, the silence of a pitch-black night was so absolute, it felt heavy, broken only by the rhythmic call of a Roman watchman or the distant braying of a pack animal. Understanding this physical grit is the only way to truly understand the stories that changed the world, because Jesus didn't teach in a vacuum, he taught in the dust. If you want to uncover the raw human reality behind the scriptures and see the Bible through the eyes of those who actually breathed its air, subscribe now. By joining us, you are choosing to look past the stained glass and step directly into the heat and the history of the first century. We are peeling back the layers of archaeology to reveal a world that is far more fascinating and far more challenging than any Sunday school illustration could ever suggest. Let us begin in Jerusalem, a city that was less a quiet sanctuary and more a pressurized furnace of political and religious tension. During the great festivals, this city of 40,000 residents would explode to nearly 10 times its size, cramming hundreds of thousands of pilgrims into every available courtyard and rooftop. Imagine the sheer noise of 250,000 people praying, bartering, and surviving within walls designed for a fraction of that number. Rising above this human sea was the Antonia Fortress, a grim stone reminder of Roman occupation that loomed directly over the temple courts. From its towers, Roman soldiers looked down on the Jewish worshippers, their iron-tipped spears glinting in the sun as a constant, silent threat. This was the atmospheric weight of the city, a place where the sacred smoke of incense was always mingled with the very real fear of imperial intervention. But just a few days' journey to the north sat Nazareth, a place so small and insignificant that it barely registered on a Roman map. If Jerusalem was a roar of stone and gold, Nazareth was a whisper of mud brick and hillside caves housing perhaps only a few hundred people. Here, life wasn't defined by grand architecture, but by the shared struggle of subsistence farmers and craftsmen who knew the history of every family in the village. In Nazareth, there were no paved boulevards or grand theaters, only winding dirt paths that turned to thick mud in the winter rains and choking dust in the summer heat. The primary sound wasn't the temple trumpet, but the rhythmic clack-clack of a weaver's loom or the heavy thud of a carpenter's mallet against local oak. This was the humble, cramped reality where the most famous figure in history spent the majority of his life far from the centers of power. Between these two extremes lay the oasis of Jericho, a city that felt like a different world entirely, sitting nearly 1,000 feet below sea level. While Jerusalem could be biting cold in the winter, Jericho remained a lush tropical escape where the scent of balsam and expensive dates filled the heavy, humid air. It was a city of transit and tolls, a crossroads where wealthy tax collectors grew rich off the sweat of merchants traveling the lowland. These cities weren't just backdrops, they were characters that shaped the very metaphors Jesus used to explain the kingdom of God. A house built on a rock wasn't a poetic idea, it was a literal necessity in a land where flash floods could vanish a poorly founded home in minutes. To understand the message, we must first understand the architecture of the life that surrounded it, starting with the most basic element of human survival: water. In the first century, water was not a utility. It was a heavy physical burden that dictated the rhythm of every woman's morning. In a village like Nazareth, there was no plumbing, only a single limestone spring that required a steep daily trek with a massive ceramic jar balanced on the head. Every drop used for cooking or washing represented a measurable amount of human sweat and muscle, making water a currency far more precious than silver. Imagine the weight of 30 gallons of water sloshing in a heavy clay vessel, the rough stone path biting into your feet as you climb back toward the village. This daily ritual at the spring was the social heartbeat of the community, the only time and place where news was traded and bonds were forged. When Jesus spoke of living water, his audience didn't think of a metaphor, they thought of the physical exhaustion that defined their lives from sunrise to sunset. In the larger city of Jerusalem, the engineering was more sophisticated, but the reality was just as crowded. The city relied on a massive network of underground cisterns and stone-carved aqueducts that funneled rainwater into public pools and ritual baths called mikvaot. To be a city dweller was to be intimately aware of the sky, for a dry winter meant a year of thirst rationing and the terrifying threat of disease in the cramped lower quarters. Move inside one of these homes and the first thing you notice is the darkness. Most families lived in a single windowless room with thick limestone walls designed to keep out the heat, but which also trapped the soot from the cooking fire. The floors were often just hard-packed earth or rough cobblestones, where the entire family would unroll their sleeping mats at night, side by side in a space smaller than a modern bedroom. There was no such thing as personal space or privacy in the ancient city. You lived, ate, and slept within inches of your siblings' parents, and often aging grandparents, all sharing the same air and the same meager resources. The walls were thin enough to hear your neighbors' muffled conversations, and the constant rustle of livestock kept in a small partitioned area of the room to protect them from theft. At the center of this domestic life was the daily bread, a process that began long before the sun peaked over the horizon. The sound of the morning was the grind and scrape of the hand mill, as women used heavy basalt stones to crush grain into a coarse gray flour. This was the labor behind the prayer for daily bread, a literal back-breaking necessity because without refrigeration, bread baked on Monday was hard as stone by Wednesday. If you walked the streets of the lower city at midday, you would have to step over open stone channels that served as the city's only sewer. The smell was a permanent fixture, pungent mix of human waste animal dung and the metallic tang of blood from the temple sacrifices. In the summer heat, the stench became a physical wall, making the purity laws of the Bible feel less like religious suggestions and more like essential survival protocols. This was the world of the market, the pulsing heart of urban life where everything was bought, sold, and haggled over in a chaotic blend of Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. You didn't go to the market for a weekly shop, you went every single day because you had no way to keep food from spoiling. This meant that every meal was a social transaction, a constant negotiation with the baker, the fisherman, and the vegetable seller. In these markets, the economic fragility of the people was on full display. A single bad harvest or an increase in Roman salt taxes could mean the difference between a full bowl of lentils and a family going to sleep hungry. This is why the tax collectors, like those in Jericho, were so despised. They were the ones who reached into these already empty bowls to feed the gluttony of a distant Roman emperor. Yet as the sun began to dip and the shadows of the massive stone buildings lengthened, the city underwent a profound transformation. The chaos of the market faded, the heat began to lift, and the second world of the ancient city emerged. It was a world of flickering oil lamps and a silence so deep it would feel unsettling to our modern ears, signaling the start of a night where safety was never guaranteed. As the last golden light vanished from the limestone walls, the city was swallowed by a darkness we can scarcely imagine today. Without streetlights or glowing shop windows, the night was a physical presence, a thick curtain that dropped over the alleys and courtyards. People didn't just go inside, they retreated, bolting heavy wooden doors and huddling around the tiny orange glow of a single clay lamp. These lamps were no larger than a human palm, holding just enough olive oil to burn for a few hours. The light they produced was feeble and flickering, casting long, dancing shadows that made the corners of the room disappear into blackness. If you ran out of oil, you were truly blind, trapped in a silence that was only broken by the occasional scurry of a rat or the distant iron clatter of a Roman patrol. This profound nighttime isolation is the secret key to understanding why Jesus spoke so often about being prepared. To be caught without oil in your lamp wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a social and physical disaster. In a world of absolute darkness, a light in the window was a beacon of life, a sign that the chaos of the outside world had been held at bay for one more night. But while the night brought silence, the dawn brought a return to the relentless grind of urban labor. By 5 in the morning, the city was already vibrating with the sounds of industry. In the artisan quarters, the air was filled with the acidic sting of the tanneries and the metallic ringing of blacksmiths shaping iron tools. There was no separation between work and home workshops, opened directly onto the street, spilling wood shavings and stone dust into the path of every passerby. In cities like Sepphoris, a bustling Greco-Roman center just a few miles from Nazareth, the construction never stopped. Herod and his sons were obsessed with stone-building grand theaters, paved forums, and elaborate bathhouses to mimic the glory of Rome. It is highly likely that a young Jesus and his father Joseph spent their days here hauling heavy timber and chiseling local limestone alongside thousands of other day laborers. This contact with the modern Roman world created a jarring contrast for the Jewish people. On one street, you might see a beautiful mosaic floor depicting a pagan god, while on the next, a group of men argued fiercely over the fine points of the Mosaic law. The cities were cultural battlegrounds, where the pressure to assimilate into the Roman lifestyle clashed daily with the desire to remain a holy and separate people. This tension was most visible in the social hierarchy that governed every greeting and seating arrangement. At the top were the priestly families living in opulent stone mansions in Jerusalem's upper city, complete with private ritual baths and imported Roman pottery. They literally looked down upon the people of the land in the lower city who lived in the cramped multi-story tenements that clung to the slopes of the Tyropoeon Valley. Beneath the wealthy and the working class were the invisible ones, the beggars, the lepers, and the chronically ill who clustered at the city gates and temple entrances. In a world without social safety nets, a disability was an economic death sentence. These people were the human debris of the urban machine, relying entirely on the alms of religious pilgrims who passed them by on their way to offer expensive sacrifices. Yet even in the midst of this rigid hierarchy, there was a powerful sense of collective identity. In the ancient city, you were never just an individual. You were a son of or a daughter of a specific house. Your family's honor was your only protection, and your neighbor's business was your business. Every meal was an act of community, usually eaten from a single large bowl where everyone dipped their bread together. This shared existence meant that when a teacher like Jesus entered a city, he wasn't just speaking to individuals, he was speaking to a living, breathing organism. He understood the smell of the market, the weight of the water jar, and the fear of the Roman spear. He used the very grit and stone of their daily lives to build a message that promised something the Roman Empire never could: a kingdom where the last were first. To truly grasp the intensity of this world, we must look at the geography of the Sea of Galilee, where the air was always thick with the smell of drying nets and salt-cured fish. Towns like Capernaum and Magdala were not sleepy villages, but bustling industrial hubs that processed the lake's bounty for export across the Roman Empire. Here, the apostles weren't just simple fishermen, they were part of a complex, taxed, and highly regulated commercial network. Imagine the shoreline at dawn crowded with heavy wooden boats and the shouting of men hauling in the night's catch. This was a place of calloused hands and wet clothes, where the miracles of a great catch of fish were heard by people who knew exactly how much that haul was worth in copper coins. The lakeside was a place of constant movement, a gateway where travelers from the east met the merchants of the west. Because Galilee was a crossroads, it was far more diverse and noisy than the Judean highlands. You would hear a dozen dialects in the markets, and the architecture reflected a world in transition where traditional Jewish stone houses sat in the shadow of Roman-style villas. This cultural mixing created a unique spiritual hunger, a desire for something that reconciled their ancient heritage with the confusing, globalized world of the Romans. This diversity extended to the very food on the table. While a wealthy merchant might feast on imported wine and meat seasoned with expensive spices, the average family survived on a repetitive diet of lentils, onions, and barley bread. Meat was a luxury reserved for the highest holy days, making the parable of the prodigal son and the slaughter of the fatted calf a moment of staggering, almost unbelievable extravagance to the original listeners. The physical act of eating was itself a lesson in social standing. In a formal setting, guests didn't sit in chairs. They reclined on cushions around a low table, leaning on one arm while eating with the other. This posture of lounging was a sign of freedom, a luxury that slaves and laborers rarely enjoyed. When Jesus sat to eat with sinners, he was offering them the physical dignity usually reserved for the elite. But the most defining feature of any city wasn't its food or its trade, it was its walls. In the first century, a city without a wall was a city waiting to die. These massive stone fortifications weren't just for defense, they were the boundaries of the civilized world. Inside was safety law, and community outside was the wilderness where bandits and wild animals ruled the night. Entering through a city gate was a sensory experience of its own. The gates were massive, reinforced with iron and wood, and served as the city's courthouse and town hall. This was where the elders sat to judge disputes, and where the news of the day was announced. To be cast out of the city gates was to lose everything: your safety, your status, and your identity. This explains the visceral shock of Jesus' ministry taking place so often in the desolate places outside the city walls. By moving his message to the hillsides and the wilderness, he was bypassing the traditional gates of power and speaking directly to the marginalized who lived on the fringes of urban life. He was creating a new kind of community that didn't depend on stone walls for its security. Yet even as he worked in the countryside, the shadow of Jerusalem always loomed in the background. For every Jew, the city was the navel of the earth, the place where heaven and earth supposedly met at the temple's Holy of Holies. No matter where you were in the world, your internal compass always pointed toward the golden heights of the Temple Mount. This religious gravity created a city of constant motion. Even during the quietest months, the streets of Jerusalem were a labyrinth of pilgrim scholars and soldiers. The economy of the city was the temple itself, a massive machine that required a constant supply of animals, wood oil, and incense. To understand Jesus' final week, we must understand how he stepped into the gears of this massive urban engine. The temple was not just a house of prayer, it was the economic lungs of Jerusalem, drawing in wealth from across the Mediterranean and exhaling it into the hands of the city's elites. Archaeological finds reveal a specialized industry of pure stone vessels, created specifically because stone was believed to be immune to ritual impurity. Thousands of artisans spent their lives carving these jars and bowls, their workshops ringing with the sound of chisels to serve a population obsessed with the boundary between the holy and the common. As you walked toward the Temple Mount, you would encounter the money changers in the royal portico, their tables cluttered with coins from a dozen different nations. Because the temple tax had to be paid in a specific Tyrian shekel, pilgrims were forced to trade their common Roman or Greek coins at unfavorable rates. This was the friction of the city, a place where spiritual devotion was constantly bumping up against the sharp edges of financial exploitation. Within the temple courts themselves, the air was never still. It was a sensory overload of lowing cattle, the sharp smell of burning fat, and the rhythmic chanting of Levites. The sheer scale of the architecture was designed to make the individual feel small, a tiny speck against the massive limestone blocks, some weighing over 500 tons, that Herod's engineers had moved with terrifying precision. Yet just a few blocks away from this grandeur, the reality of the lower city was a nightmare of overcrowding and poor sanitation. Houses were built one on top of the other, clinging to the steep slopes of the hills. If you lived here, your life was defined by the press, a constant physical contact with strangers that made the spread of disease a lingering everyday fear. In these cramped quarters, the roof of a house was more than just a cover. It was the only extra living space a family had. It was where you went to catch a breeze, to dry flax, or to sleep during the suffocatingly hot summer nights. Because the roofs were often made of simple beams covered with brush and packed mud, they were fragile. This is the physical reality that allowed a group of friends to literally dig through a ceiling to lower a paralyzed man to Jesus. It wasn't a feat of demolition, but a desperate act of moving earth and branches. This closeness of life created a culture of extreme social observation. In a village like Nazareth, or a neighborhood in Jerusalem, nothing was private. Your neighbors knew what you ate, who visited your home, and whether you were keeping the Sabbath laws. This lack of anonymity acted as a social glue, but it also created a crushing pressure to conform to the expectations of the community. This is why the synagogue was so central to urban life, appearing in every significant town from Capernaum to Magdala. It wasn't just a place for the Sabbath, it was the town square, the local court, and the primary school. Archaeological remains show these buildings were often the most impressive structures in the village, positioned so that every path seemed to lead toward them. Inside the synagogue, the seating was a map of the local social hierarchy. The best seats were reserved for the wealthy and the learned, while the poor stood or sat on the floor at the back. When Jesus challenged these seating arrangements, he was attacking the very fabric of how these people organized their world. He was suggesting that in the eyes of God, the stone carver in the back was more significant than the landlord in the front. Education in these towns was an oral tradition, a world of memory rather than books. While a few elite boys might study the scrolls in the synagogue school, most children learned the rhythm of the law by hearing it recited daily in their homes. The words were woven into the chores of the day, repeated over the grinding of grain and the weaving of cloth, until they were as familiar as the taste of barley bread. For a young man in a city like Nazareth, his identity was his trade. By the age of 12, a boy was no longer a child but an apprentice, his hands beginning to grow thick and scarred from the tools of his father. He was being integrated into the economic survival of his family, a transition that meant the end of play and the beginning of a life defined by the weight of timber or the stubbornness of stone. The transition from childhood to labor was not a choice, but a necessity in a world where 40% of a family's production might be siphoned away by Roman taxes and temple tithes. If you were a day laborer in a city like Jericho, your life was a series of hiring fairs at the city gate. You stood there at dawn, hoping a landowner would tap your shoulder for a day's work in the date groves, knowing that if you weren't picked, your family wouldn't eat that night. This economic desperation is the pulse behind many of the parables. When Jesus spoke of a landowner hiring workers at the 11th hour, his audience felt the literal stomach-churning anxiety of those men standing in the dust as the shadows grew long. They understood that in the ancient city, unemployment wasn't a statistic. It was a slow descent into debt slavery or starvation. But life wasn't only labor. It was also governed by the sacred rhythm of the Sabbath. As the sun set on Friday, the frantic energy of the markets and workshops simply stopped. In Jerusalem, a trumpet blast from the Temple Heights signaled the time of the cessation. It was a radical weekly protest against the Roman economic machine, a day where the slave and the master theoretically occupied the same spiritual ground. Inside the home, the Sabbath was marked by the lighting of a special lamp and the consumption of food prepared the day before. Archaeological evidence shows that even the poorest homes had small niches carved into the stone specifically for these Sabbath lights. It was a day of forced rest that allowed a population exhausted by physical toil to remember they were more than just the tools of their Roman or priestly masters. This weekly pause created a shared mental landscape. While the Romans measured time by the reigns of emperors and the cycles of tax collection, the people of Judea and Galilee measured time by the festivals and the reading of the Torah. Their lives were a cycle of waiting for the rains, waiting for the Sabbath, and waiting for the consolation of Israel that would break the Roman yoke. This longing was particularly intense in the cities of Galilee, which sat in the shadow of Mount Arbel. These cliffs were honeycombed with caves where rebels and zealots hid looking down on the Roman roads. The cities below were not just places of trade. They were places of surveillance where a misplaced word in a crowded market could lead to a swift arrest by the local tetrarch's guards. You can see this tension in the very coins found in the ruins of these cities. Some bear the image of the emperor, a symbol of pagan power that many Jews refused to even touch. Others minted locally featured palm trees or anchors, neutral symbols that tried to navigate the thin line between religious law and political reality. Every transaction was a reminder of who truly owned the land. And yet in the middle of this occupied, crowded, and exhausted world, a new kind of social movement was beginning to form. It didn't start in the palaces of the upper city or the fortresses of the Romans. It started in the fishing boats and the small-town synagogues, spreading through the informal networks of women at the wells and craftsmen in their shops. It was a movement that used the familiar language of the city to subvert the city's power. When Jesus talked about a city on a hill that cannot be hidden, his listeners looked up at the stone walls of Jerusalem or the fortress of Machaerus. He was taking the images of imperial and religious strength and repurposing them for a kingdom that lived in the hearts of the poor. To walk the streets with Jesus was to see the familiar world through a different lens. The widow's mite wasn't just a small donation. It was a critique of a temple system that accepted the last penny of the destitute. The Good Samaritan wasn't just a nice story. It was a scandal that suggested a hated outsider understood the law better than the urban elite who walked by on the other side. Okay, as we look at these ancient urban landscapes, we must confront the reality of the night watchman. Every city had the men who paced the walls and the dark intersections of the lower city while the rest of the world slept. They were the thin line between a peaceful night and a city engulfed in the flames of a riot or the blades of a thief. Their rhythmic calls through the silence were the only clock the ancient world knew after sunset. These watchmen were a living metaphor for spiritual vigilance. When Jesus warned his followers to stay awake, for they did not know at what hour the master of the house would return. His audience thought of the cold, lonely figure on the ramparts. They understood that in the ancient city to fall asleep on watch was not just a mistake, it was a betrayal of the entire community's safety. The architecture of the gate, the height of the wall, and the rotation of the guard all pointed to a single truth. These people lived in a world of constant vulnerability. Whether it was the threat of a Roman legion, the spread of a fever in the crowded tenements, or the failure of the winter rains, the urban dweller was always one crisis away from total ruin. This vulnerability is what made the message of the gospel so revolutionary. In a world where your worth was determined by your family's honor, your physical health, or your proximity to the temple, Jesus offered a foundation that didn't rely on limestone or gold. He was building a new Jerusalem out of people, not stones, a city where the walls were made of mercy and the gates were always open. Looking back from our modern world of steel and glass, it is easy to romanticize the ancient city. But to do so is to miss the point. The cities Jesus walked were places of profound grit and suffering. By understanding the weight of the water jars and the stench of the streets, we begin to see that faith isn't something that happens in a clean, quiet sanctuary. It is something that is forged in the heat of a crowded market and the darkness of a windowless room. This historical reality reveals a startling truth about human nature. We have always been a species that builds walls, social, economic, and physical, to feel safe. Yet the most powerful moments in history often happen when someone is willing to step outside those walls. Jesus didn't stay in the safety of the synagogue. He went to the unclean places, the crowded places, and the forgotten places where life was most raw. We often think of the ancient world as primitive, but their social problems were remarkably similar to our own. They grappled with the gap between the ultra-wealthy and the working poor, the tension of living under a government they didn't trust, and the struggle to maintain a sense of community in a dense, anonymous urban environment. The dust of Jerusalem is the same dust we walk today, just covered by layers of asphalt. There is a deep, quiet wisdom in the ancient rhythm of the night. In a world without constant artificial light, people were forced to confront the silence and the stars. They understood their own smallness in a way that we, with our perpetually glowing screens, often forget. This forced pause allowed for a level of reflection and spiritual awareness that is increasingly difficult to find in our 24-hour society. Ultimately, the story of these cities is a story of the search for meaning in the midst of a very difficult reality. Whether it was a fisherman in Capernaum or a priest in Jerusalem, every person was trying to navigate a world that felt both sacred and broken. The fact that the most influential message in history was born in this specific, gritty, and oppressed environment is a testament to the power of hope when it is grounded in real human experience. As you walk away from the narrow streets of the first century, remember that the stones may have crumbled, but the human stakes remain the same. The next time you read a gospel story, don't picture a painting. Feel the heat of the sun, hear the noise of the market, and imagine the flickering light of a single oil lamp. If this journey through the dust of history has deepened your understanding of the world behind the Bible, please like and subscribe to continue our exploration. We've only just begun to uncover the lived reality of the people who saw the world change forever.